Now remember, at this point in our Mark series, Jesus is at the temple, and so far in chapter 12, he's been fielding all kinds of questions in response to the religious leaders confronting him as a way of trying to expose him and publicly challenge Jesus' authority. But Jesus, as we've seen in chapter 12, has answered every single one of their questions with amazing intelligence and grace. The scribes and the Pharisees, they just can't seem to get Jesus to look bad. No matter how many clever riddles or theological questions they come up with, Jesus solves every single one of them. But now, in the remainder of chapter 12, the tables turn, and it's Jesus' turn to ask the questions and to teach. And so Jesus poses his own theological question or riddle and proceeds to give some teaching. Now, at a surface level, the two main parts here in our text seem at a surface reading to have nothing in common. I mean, what is an ancient riddle about from the Psalms about David's king or Lord have anything to do with men in flowy robes and a little widowed woman in the temple treasury? But as we'll see, at a much deeper level, these things actually are deeply connected. I think Jesus is up to something here, and I want to show you what that is. But in order to do that, we have to work back through each of those two parts in the text real quickly. Is that all right? All right, well, here we go. Now, but before we start reading verse 35 again, keep in mind, Jesus, the whole chapter, has been on the defensive against his skeptics, against his critics, people who don't believe in him, people who are challenging Jesus, people who are opposing Jesus with intellectual questions. He's been on the defensive, but for the first time, this is Jesus going on the offensive, which is interesting. For the first time, Jesus puts forth his own argument from the scriptures for his authority. So what is Jesus' argument from the Bible for who he really is? This is interesting. Look at verse 35. It says, while Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, and then Jesus quotes Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? The large crowd listened to him with delight. So what is Jesus saying here? And his riddle from Psalm 110. Well, first of all, Jesus is starting with a premise that everyone back then believed and that everyone back then would have understood. And the premise that Jesus is using for his question was that all the Hebrew prophets had predicted a Christos in the Greek, or a Messiah, an anointed king who was going to come one day and put everything to right in Israel. And that was the premise that Jesus starts with. And everyone in Jewish thinking, by the way, in Jesus' audience, believed that. They were waiting for a Messiah to come in Israel. And all the prophets also said that when that Messiah comes, he would be a descendant of David. He would come in the line of David, and therefore he would be David's son, as it were. So, Jesus says in his question, if that's the case, then how do you explain Psalm 110? Because in Psalm 110, which is a psalm of David, you have David talking about this great figure in Psalm 110 who God sends, who's going to put all enemies down, all enemies of justice, all enemies of God. This is clearly the Messiah that David is talking about. And in the psalm, David says, the Lord said to my Lord, and then he refers to this messianic figure. Or in other words, don't miss this, David calls this Messiah figure my Lord or my King. Now, why would David do that? Because understand, if David, one of the greatest kings in all of Israel's history, was referring to one of his own descendants born in his line, he would never call him my Lord. Back in ancient times, he'd call him my son. Especially, in an honor-shame society that this was, it was always the job of the son to honor the father, never the other way around. No king ever called his son king or Lord. And so Jesus' final question, his challenge to all the skeptics is, how can this Messiah figure be David's son, but also be David's Lord or king? Now, I admit Jesus' argument is quite tailored to his culture and not our culture today, but I believe at the same time there's a lot that we can learn from Jesus' argument, because what is Jesus essentially saying here? Jesus is saying, how can David's Lord also be David's son? And the answer is, the Messiah can only be David's son if he's also God's son. Jesus is saying, you guys, and he's talking to this whole crowd of skeptics in front of him, he's saying, you guys have a view of the Messiah that he's just a human. You believe that he's just going to be a human figure. He's going to come and bring political liberation for Israel. But if that's the case, then how do you explain this? The biblical text is inexplicable unless you realize that this will not just be a figure who comes in the line of David and David's son, but that this will also be a divine son, God's son, come in David's line, that it will be a divine human figure who comes not simply to put down the political enemies of Israel, but a figure who comes to put down the enemies of the whole human race, to put down sin, to destroy death itself, to destroy evil for the whole world. In other words, Jesus says that you guys all have a filter over your mind. You have human paradigms of what the Messiah is supposed to be like, but the Bible blasts them all away. And only I can fulfill who the Messiah really is. Jesus is saying, only I can fulfill it. Now, once again, Jesus tailored this argument for his time, but it turns out it is absolutely relevant for us today as well, because you and I also live in a culture where people are skeptical of Jesus. We live in a culture where people challenge the idea of Jesus, in a culture where, on one hand, there are people, all sorts of people who claim that Jesus was just a man. He was just a good teacher, rabbi in the first century who taught some good principles. And then on the other spectrum today in our culture, we also have a bunch of religious people who think that they have Jesus completely figured out. And there's all kinds of religious people today have a version of following Jesus where they adamantly seem to know all of the answers, and they live seemingly very moral lives on the exterior, but when you get close up, something seems a bit off. And it's interesting to me, Jesus shows us, first of all, that he won't fit into any of those boxes. Okay, he invites both parties, the intellectually skeptical and the religious traditionalists, both parties alike, to recognize that Jesus transcends our human boxes of thinking. And the way that Jesus invites them to recognize this is he invites us to look at him very closely in the scriptures. With this psalm, and he does this here with a very logical argument from the Psalms, and this is something, by the way, that I love about Jesus. Understand that Jesus isn't just some guru, who's out there pontificating about what is the sound of one hand clapping and a bunch of bogus mystical stuff. But Jesus actually operates in the domain of reason and logic all the time. I mean, we've just seen in this whole chapter, very intelligent questions come to Jesus, and he uses logic and reason to handle every single one of them. He invites the questions, but he operates in the domain of reason and logic. He logically addresses their questions, and now he presents a very logical argument for who he is, and this is how he does it, okay? This is how he does it with his audience. By going to the Psalms here, Jesus is essentially challenging his audience back then, and I believe he's challenging us today as well, and his invitation for all of us is essentially this. Jesus is saying to us, look deeply into the scriptures and strip away what you think I should be like, what you've been told I'm like, what culture has told you I'm like, what the church has told you I'm like. Strip away what you wish I was like and see me for who I really am. And if you see Jesus in the text for who he really is, if you see him walking and talking, if you see him living and teaching and doing miracles, if you see who Jesus is really actually claiming to be, if you see him dying and rising in the scriptures, if you actually see who Jesus really is in the scriptures, then in the end, you will not be able to explain Jesus other than to say the only way to explain this person Jesus is that he's not just David's son, but he's God's son. He's not just a human being or a great rabbi from the first century. He's so much more. And so first of all, in this text, we see, first of all, Jesus can handle the skeptics. I mean, we've seen this all chapter long. He welcomes the questions. Jesus is unafraid of our doubts and our intellectual questions today. But not only that, but Jesus actually challenges his critics. And I believe he challenges every single one of us with the challenge that is this. He's essentially saying, I dare you all to read me in the text, in the scriptures, to read about me, to contemplate me, and to try to explain me, other than to say this is not just David's son, but God's son. And when you see who the Bible is really saying he is, you and I both have to wrestle with the reality that he's so much bigger than all the human categories we try to fit him into. He's not just another powerful figure from human history. I mean, when you read the scriptures, this is the king of the cosmos. This is the creator come among us as a man. Jesus breaks the mold. He transcends the trends. He shifts the paradigms. He blows up all of the stereotypes. He's not just a human, he's divine. He's not just a king, he's the king. He's so much greater than we think. So Jesus first, he's making it clear, this Messiah is different from our expectations. And what it looks like to follow this Messiah looks different from what we would expect as well, which brings us to the next part, where Jesus immediately follows his riddle to take a jab at the religious leaders around him by contrasting them with a widow. So, in this comparison Jesus gives, on the one hand, you have the teachers of the law. It could also be translated as scribes. This was the religious elites, very wealthy, very educated. They usually rolled with the Pharisees in the day. And this is what Jesus says about them in verse 38. So as he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Keep in mind, the people Jesus is talking about, the teachers of the law, are the Bible experts of the day, the religious elite, and Jesus doesn't have very nice things to say about them at all. He says, watch out for them. That's actually the only command in our text today. It's beware of, look out for this. And he describes them in a way that is very visual. Jesus is a master of creating imagery and his teaching, by the way. And so, you have to picture what Jesus is doing here. He turns to the crowd and he says, watch out for these men, these scribes who go about wearing these long, flowy robes in public. And back then, the scribes and the Pharisees would wear these glamorous robes. They also had these prayer shawls. Theirs would have tassels hanging from the four corners. Mine does not. Thank you. Whatever that was. They're enjoying it. They're enjoying my look. You can have it as well. These actually aren't authentic people. You can find these probably at Urban Outfitters in the Jesus costume section. They are gender neutral. But these men, Jesus is pointing out, these men, they walk around in these glamorous flowing robes, which actually distinguished the rabbis and the scholars as being men of importance and wealth. They were very expensive robes. But here's the point of the robes and the prayer shawls were actually for the use of worship in the synagogue. The problem was the teachers of the law would wear them everywhere they go, so everyone could see how important of a role they play. So they wear these long, flowy robes in the marketplace. They want to be having the seat of honor. They take the seat of honor at the banquet. They sit right next to the host or at the head of the table. Jesus says they take the seat of honor in the synagogue. Now, the scribes actually had seats right in the middle of the synagogue, facing everyone where they could sit, the seat of honor. A modern-day equivalent would be sitting, on a chair up on a stage, and so these men had their long, flowy robes and prayer shawls. They sat in the seat of honor, up and elevated above everyone. And after a while, the view's pretty good from up here. You can start to think, if you're not careful, that you're a pretty important person. And so they're sitting in these seats, elevated in their long, flowy robes. Jesus says they're praying lengthy prayers for show. So they're sitting up on these, chairs praying, "Holy, holy, holy, holy Lord, Father God, Lord, Father God, Lord." Very impressive, very spiritual prayers. And he says it's all for show. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes as far to say of the same group, the scribes and the Pharisees, that in the marketplace, they would actually pull out a trumpet or a horn, and they would blow the horn right before they gave a gift so that everyone could see that they were giving a gift in public. Just ridiculous, So could you imagine, today in the garage, someone comes in the gathering to give their offering in the bowl, and they pull out a horn and they go, and then they put their bills in. I mean, this is ridiculous. This visual, and don't any of you get any ideas, by the way. But this is bizarre. This picture that Jesus is painting. In fact, the saying we have to toot your own horn or to blow your own horn. This is actually where it comes from. The scribes in the Bible. And so Jesus paints this whole elaborate picture as a way of saying that he's just not into this kind of thing at all. Why is he not into it? Well, he says in the text, first of all, because of the hypocrisy of what the scribes are doing. He says it's for show. In fact, that's what it says in verse 40. He says, for a show, they make lengthy prayers. These guys are showboaters, play actors. They're phonies. They think they have it all figured out, but they're actually hiding behind a form of empty religion that they've created, where it's all about this false display of holiness and glamorous good deeds done in public for everyone to see so they will be impressed. But even more disturbing than the fact that they're pretending is that they're actually also evildoers. Verse 40 says they devour widows' houses. Now, to devour houses, that was a technical term back then for defrauding someone's property or funds. And so he says they're defrauding widows' houses. The teachers of the law back then were working in collusion with the wealthy class to further themselves at the expense of some of the marginalized people in society, which, by the way, Jesus is disgusted by. Literally, he uses very strong language. He says that they will be punished most severely. All throughout the Bible, we learn that God identifies very strongly with the poor and the orphaned and the widowed. All throughout the Old Testament and the prophets, over and over again, God says things like, if you steal from the widowed, you're actually stealing from me. Well, when you neglect the poor, you're actually neglecting me. Over and over again, we see God's heart. He makes it clear in the scriptures, essentially saying, my heart is so deeply bound up with the needs, with the suffering of the poor and the widowed, that if you move against them, you actually move against me. If you ignore them, you're actually ignoring me. And so Jesus is talking about this theme, and then he contrasts the scribes and Pharisees by turning to one of these marginalized people, immediately turning to a widow. And this is an incident that actually takes place where he sees a widow come into the temple courts. We'll read it. Look at verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. So in the scene, Jesus is watching all these people, and they're giving their offerings in the temple treasury, and Jesus is watching. And you know, if I was a certain kind of preacher at this point, I would say, now, when you give your offering, you need to know Jesus is watching you. I'm not going to go there, though. Although, you know, this can be a great message on stewardship and generosity. I think what's happening is actually much bigger than that. So Jesus is watching, and the rich come in, and they're putting their, large amounts in the offering, probably in their nice clothes, some sounding their trumpets as they give, no doubt. But Jesus isn't interested in that. Instead, he takes us to the back of the temple treasury, to an obscure part of the temple treasury known as the court of the women, where he points out that this little widowed woman is giving a gift of 2 small copper coins, it says. Actually, it's the word lepta in the Greek. So she gives 2 leptai, which was the smallest form of currency in circulation at the time. It was much smaller than even our modern day penny. And so Jesus is saying, hey, listen, I'm not interested in the showboaters up in the front showing off these large amounts they're throwing. He's just like, come back here, check this out, guys. He brings his disciples over and he says, look at this little old widow woman putting her 2 little copper pennies in the tithe box. He says, This is what I'm interested in. This is what fascinates me because, Jesus says, though the amount of her gift is smallest, her sacrifice was the greatest. And he goes as far to say, look back at verse 44. He says, she gave out of her poverty. She put in everything, all she had to live on. I should have gotten in shape for today's sermon. How'd you pull a groin, Ian? Oh, preaching. Here's what I want to do. We're almost done. I want to draw your attention to that last part of verse 44 because I think this is where everything ties together, and then we'll go to worship and the tables, okay? Unfortunately, there's not a single English translation that I could find that was willing to be as radical as Jesus' actual words in the Greek are at the end of verse 44. Because literally, in the original text of Mark, Jesus says she gave out of her poverty, she gave everything, even her whole life. He literally says the woman puts in her bios, B-I-O-S. It's the word for physical life. He says she put in everything. She gave her bios, her whole life. Jesus literally says she gave her life away. What's Jesus saying? I think I know what he's saying. When the rich give, in fact, let's be honest, when we give, as Americans, we always give out of our margin. In other words, we tend to only give money. Because, when I give a gift of money, when we're done giving, are we eating anything less? No. Oh, we don't give that much. My family still has food on the table after I give. Or, for example, are we dressing any worse after we give? Oh, we don't give that much. We give out of our margin. When I give, to be personal, when I give, I'm not driving any less. I don't give up my car. When I give, I just give money. But the widow didn't. Jesus said when this woman put in her last discretionary cash she had, she was literally taking food out of her own mouth. And much more than that, she was giving up what little control she had of her life. You see, when the rest of us give, we tend to only give what we can afford to give without, losing any real control of what's happening in our lives. But when she gave, she didn't just give her money, she gave her life because it was all she had. She gave up control. Now, why is Jesus telling us this? And why here of all places? Why is Jesus bringing this up here? It's a heartwarming little message about financial stewardship. But why? I've always wondered, is this a tack on? Why does Jesus tell this story right at the end of a chapter that's all about the skeptics hounding Jesus? And I don't think this story is a tack on. I, in fact, think it's the climax. And let me explain why, how this all comes together. For starters, let's be honest, today, as Portlanders, we have intellectual doubts. And we have intellectual questions. And those are important. We talk about that kind of stuff all the time around here at this church, and we want this, by the way, to be a safe place for you to process your doubts, to come with your questions. Wherever you're at in the spectrum and the journey, you're welcome here. We want you to come with your questions. We want this to be a place where we can do our best to equip you guys with scholarly resources to help you navigate through some of those questions and those doubts as much as we can. But let's be honest. The reason for our intellectual doubts in our culture today is not so much that we want to believe intellectually, but most of the time it's that we don't want to trust. It's because we're afraid. Our problem is not so much the disbelief of the mind as it is the fear of the heart. We say things like, we can't, but actually what's going on is we won't. Because human beings, we're scared to lose control. To actually surrender everything in our lives to this Jesus, to give him everything, all of us, well, that means we have to lose control. And so sometimes we can just hide behind our intellectual questions as a way of not having to really give up everything to follow Jesus. And Jesus is saying, listen, I welcome the intellectual questions. Come with those things. I can handle those things. And he's saying, listen, and I'm not just David's son. I'm the Son of God. And there are logical arguments for Jesus. He gives us one example of one here from the scriptures and the Psalms, but we have all kinds of logical arguments and evidence for Jesus, for things like the resurrection of Jesus that are resources outside of the scriptures as well. We have rational evidence, we have empirical evidence, we have existential evidence for Jesus of all kinds. But the truth is, understand you're not ever going to get all of the intellectual answers that you want. And there's some great answers out there, some great resources. They're very helpful. They're not all watertight, but they are very helpful. The point is, you're not going to ever get all of the intellectual answers you need for Jesus. It's not until you look deeply into the scriptures and see who this Jesus figure really is, who he really claims to be. And it's not until you give up your control and open up all of your life to him and give everything to him. It's not until you reach that point that you're ever going to fully see and know that Jesus really is everything that he claims to be. That he really is more than David's son. He's the Son of God, that he is joy and peace and hope and meaning and life, that he is the King of the universe. You see, the woman in the story, she was trusting God. She was giving so much that she had to trust God. She was losing control. She gave her life away. The rich, on the other hand, who could give large amounts that were actually just a tiny fraction of the surplus of the riches that they had, were scared to give of their lives in ways that would actually cost them something. They were spiritual cowards. Whereas the woman had spiritual bravery and therefore love. She actually surrendered complete control of her life to God. And might I just say, perhaps the reason that we don't believe like we should, the reason that I don't trust God like I should, the reason that some of us don't connect with God like we should, perhaps it's because we too are scared of losing control. We don't want to give up control. We're scared. And so some of us can just hide behind our intellectual questions. But I think many others of us, some of you do that, but many others of us, most of us as church people in the room today, and this is where it goes back to the teachers of the law, I think most of us tend to hide behind religious activity. We go through all the motions, come to church, give something, check off the boxes, do some good deeds, make sure others see us. Many of us try to maintain this perception of ourselves at church or in our community as if we have everything together, when in reality, at the core, it's the same exact problem. We're also scared to really surrender everything to Jesus, to really give up control in our lives, to go all in, to allow Jesus to be king of everything in our lives, our money, our sexuality, our business practices, how we treat others, whether or not we forgive someone who's wronged us, our neglect of the poor and the orphan and the widowed who we pass by in our own lives. And Jesus says, I'm looking for what the widow has. The kind of faith that will give up everything to follow me, a reckless faith, a dangerous trust, a costly hope, to give control. So to close, what does this mean for us? Maybe this could have something to do with some of our announcements and family news today, earlier, because I think in one sense, today's passage is a great summary of a lot of our heart as a church, because at this church, no matter what person is leading this on our leadership team, no matter who is ever up here on the stage, we're always at this church going to be a church that takes people to the scriptures to look deeply into the Bible to see who Jesus really is. And we're always going to be a church that invites people to give their whole lives to follow him, no matter who's leading. And we're going to do that in gatherings. We're going to do that in missional communities. And you guys play such a huge role in that. We're at this pivotal point as our church, a fun transition. We're 10 years old. There's some transitions happening, but we're looking forward to the next 10 years as a church and believing God's going to do some amazing things. And it takes a whole army of men and women to reach a city for Jesus. And we believe there's so many more people in West Portland that Jesus wants to reach. And so we're asking you guys to continue to journey with us. But for all of us collectively as a church through transitions and things, it's going to require us to trust God. But you know what? I think the text gets a lot more personal than that. And this is what I want to close with. I don't know where this sermon might hit you personally. This morning, a sermon about trust and giving up control, going all in like the widow. For me, and I hesitated to share this, but to be vulnerable with you guys, my wife and I just miscarried a baby a couple weeks ago on Mother's Day. And we're okay. It was early in the pregnancy, and we're really grateful for that. But I know right now in my life, today, I've been studying all week, and just God's been working on me. Like I know God's saying to me today, Ian, are you going to trust me? Because this is not fun to lose control, is it? Many of you have been there. It's not fun to lose control. And God's asking me to trust him today, to not be bitter, to not get lost in my doubts and hide behind my questions, but to come to God with those things, to be vulnerable. God's asking me to not play the fake religious game and just pretend around everyone that everything's all right in my life. And God's asking me to trust him, even when it hurts. What about you? And where are you at today? Does Jesus have all of your life? For some of you here, you've been tracking with us in Mark for a while now. and you've been coming to this church, but the jury's still out for you. You've yet to surrender your whole life completely to Jesus. And Jesus is inviting you today to come to him with your intellectual questions, with the doubts you have. He's not afraid of those things. He invites you to come with those things. And he's saying to you, do you see who I am yet? Can you see it in the scriptures? Do you see who I really am? I am the king. And in order to follow me, you're going to have to give up control. And for some of you today, this is about surrendering your life to Jesus for the very first time. Some of you today need to do that. But I think for others of us, most of us, there's probably a simple reminder today that Jesus wants to give us to give him our whole lives, to trust him again and again. This is what it's all about. Jesus isn't into our religious games and the show we can put on, pretending everything is all right, impressing people. What's really going on in your life right now? What are the hurts in your life? What are the fears that you've been wrestling with in your life? What are your doubts? What are your questions you've had? What are your sins? Well, what's your hypocrisy in your life? What's your greed? What are the worries that you have right now? Jesus says we have to give up control of all of that in order to follow him. And he's inviting us to trust him, to give him our whole lives today, again and again.